And
Thank you very much, Levon. Can you hear me okay? Well, over the next 3 hours, I'm going to talk to you a lot about green leases and green leasing. And it's amazing to be here, actually, because my first ever conference I ever went to was the EFMC in Glasgow. And then I was a terrified master student who bit all his fingernails off, going, I've just started a PhD and it's all mad. And now, 4 years later, and 2 weeks ago, I got my PhD. But I'm still terrified, still biting my fingernails and going, it's all just mad. So some things never change. And so my name's Dave. I'm originally from the UK. I'm from Wales. But my last name is from Ireland, so I'm kind of Irish, you could say. And today I'll be talking to you about green leases and green leasing in sustainable office buildings. Now, I got to do the slide there. Aha! I've called the main title of this presentation Opportunity Knocks, because I kind of realized that there is an underlying opportunity here for the way we can change how we interact with the built environment. That we've developed all of these strategies and all of this technology over decades, and now we're at the point where we can seize that opportunity, and hopefully my PhD project went some way towards bringing that together into something more useful. Now, for any of you in this room that are doing a PhD or have done a PhD, you will recognize that when you started your PhD, you kind of thought, okay, I can see the goal. 3-4 years away, I do my classes, I do my research, and I'll get there in the end. And then, of course, about 2 weeks in, you realize your PhD is much more like this. And basically, it's different degrees of panic with productivity sliced up in chunks in between all of these events. So I'm talking about green leases, I'm talking about green leasing, and why is it important to talk about these issues? Why is it important to talk about these issues? Because, well, sustainability is a hot topic. You just have to take a look at the program today to see how many presentations are talking about sustainability to a greater or lesser degree. And it's also in the industry as well. It's not just academics, it's practitioners as well. And in terms of my PhD in Norway, the rental level in Scandinavia was very, very high. And between 2011 and 2014, in Oslo alone, commercial rent per square meter went down 10%. So to address sustainability in the built environment from the perspective of renting is really, really important. And so rent is becoming more competitive all over, and there are lots and lots of stakeholders that are a part of this development. So landlords and tenants and facilities managers, of course, and consumers. But there are still some underlying issues that we have to deal with in the industry. So we have a terminological problem. So we're using all sorts of different words for things, and green leases are no example. That you can call it green leases, green leasing. Americans are starting to call them energy-aligned leases. So there's all sorts of different words that we can use for all of these sorts of things. But my PhD project, what was it about more specifically? Now, I do apologize that I don't like to have very wordy slides, but I'm going to break the rules for this presentation a little bit because it was my PhD project. There are more words than that, I promise. That wasn't a joke. You can decide how much of it's a joke later on. So the main title of my PhD project was Green Leasing, a study of the barriers and drivers for green leased offices in Norway. Now, green leases and green leasing are two separate things. A green lease is a piece of paper, like a regular lease with clauses in it that affect the sustainability of a building, whilst green leasing, which is the main focus of my project, green leasing is about operating a building that is available for rental in a sustainable manner. So it's not just about sustainable facilities management, it's about doing that specifically through the rental market and the different issues that are in there. So the main aim of my thesis was to advance knowledge in this by looking at the barriers and drivers associated with the implementation of green leasing in commercial offices, mostly in Norway, but I did research abroad as well, in the UK, in the United States. I have such a hard life. I had to go to Chicago and look at all the nice buildings and put on twice my body weight because an ice cream was 1,800 calories and all that kind of stuff. And my project was divided into 3 core research questions. So the first research question was looking at to what degree is green leasing been already studied and looked into in academia and practice. That was a question. The results of that question I actually presented at my first ever EFMC conference back in 2015. Secondly, I wanted to look at what the barriers and drivers were in the development of green leasing and sustainable buildings in general. And then finally, look at what opportunities does this present for us in facilities management, which is probably going to be the bit that will be most interesting for all of us in the room today. And countries do PhD theses by different means, but I did my thesis by publication. So over the course of 4 years, I wrote 9 publications because I need to get myself a life and do other things apart from... That's very rock and roll, isn't it? Just writing articles. Yeah, maybe I'm the Mick Jagger, I don't know, of writing things. But the core of my PhD study was divided into 3 main studies. So I drew this little model to try and explain that. So at the very top, you can see study 1. And in study 1, I spoke to experts in sustainability in the built environment from Norway, the United Kingdom, and Sweden as well, to look at, was this a project worth pursuing? Was looking at how the barriers and drivers for sustainable offices, was it something that was worth pursuing? And I found out, yes, it was. Then I went down to study 2. I wish I had one of those like laser pens so I could point. Study 2, I traveled to the UK and I traveled to Norway, to the United States and contacted people in Norway to ask building owners and tenants, what were the things that either motivated you to develop your building in a sustainable way, or what was the motivation for you to occupy that building, that sustainable building, as opposed to one that is not? And I got to speak to 19 different buildings and their owners and tenants. That was a lot of fun. And then finally, in study 3, I gave out a survey to 55, I offered it to 2,000 people, but got 55 responses to an online survey looking into a bit more depth into the barriers and drivers just in Norway, but also looking at what facilities management were they employing in these really, really interesting sustainable buildings. So I'm going to try and keep my presentation today relatively short, so we'll see. But I'm now going to go through what I found out from these research questions earlier on. So the first research question, to what extent is green leases and green leasing being looked at in academia and practice at the moment? Well, I concluded that it's really, really seeing an increase in terms of its attention. So the word green lease was first used in academia in 2007, and it has exploded exponentially in research. I was commenting at the party last night, and this is why my voice is going. I knew all the words to all of those fantastic Irish folk songs. So I sound today like a 40-a-day smoker, despite the fact I do not smoke. I was talking to them last night about when I first came to the EFMC in Glasgow. I said, I'm doing green leases, and they're going, what's that? And now I almost don't have to explain it to anybody. It's just grown massively in the past couple of years. So it's been really great. I got in just at the right time, and I was also found out that I think I wrote the very first PhD thesis ever solely on green leasing. So I really got there just in time. But the problem is, although we are researching it, there is still not a direct track towards doing it in a way that's more organized. So most of this research is being done in the context of other research. We are using all sorts of different words for green leasing, and we should be trying to stick to one word so we can all follow what the research is together. Because if Spain is calling it a different word, and I don't know what that word is, I can't follow the research. So we need to be better at that. And also, there is still a surprisingly high failure rate of its implementation because simply we're not recording the damage control well. There's so many different ways that people are employing green leasing that it's causing really, really significant problems. There is a difference between green leases and green leasing, as I said earlier. One's a document, the other is an operational phase, active leasing out a building in a sustainable way. And I'm really proud of the fact that I think one of the outcomes that I think is the most significant of my thesis is I was the first one to define green leasing as a facilities management term. So hopefully, if you read my paper in the conference proceedings, you can go and use that. It's a gift from me to you. But there's still no universally accepted definition of either of these things, which is still a challenge. So that's another thing I have to work on next, is trying to see if we can get some kind of industry standard. And an understanding as to what constitutes the barriers and drivers is also very important to establish, which I have attempted to do with my second research question. So what are the barriers and drivers for the development and lease-up of sustainable green leased office buildings from the perspective of owners and tenants? A nice, short, sexy research question. So the drivers and barriers that I looked at showed that there's actually a lot of diversity in terms of the barriers and drivers, which makes it very difficult for us to work out the things that we should focus on to increase the implementation of green leases and green leasing. So I was hoping that in the context of owners and tenants, I would find definitive barriers and drivers that think, okay, we can work on this, we can work on costs, or we can work on financial incentives. But that didn't really happen in quite the way that I hoped it would. So I think we need a larger research project to work out what these things are. And also I discovered that there was a large weakness in terms of legislation at this point. So a lot of the really good work that's happening in this field about increasing the sustainable credibility of commercial buildings actually comes from the private sector. It's things like BREEAM certifications that are doing the work. There's a plethora of reasons why governments and legislation is a little weak. A lot of it is due to very typical political reasons, such as governments rely on voters, and if you make things too burdensome, you maybe lose some of those. So it's, of course, much more complex than this. But legislation is still very, very weak. And in terms of tenants, there was not completely, but there was a degree of commonality. So when I spoke to tenants in these buildings, they were very much saying that it's not all about costs, but costs matter. And there were lots of debates about things like, well, we know that this BREEAM certified office building is more expensive to rent per square meter, but the operational costs are so much lower that it means that we can offset that and we can have a better quality workspace, and with lower operational costs, it means it's good for us. So that was one of the outcomes I found out. But also, these barriers and drivers, they might be a little too not very generalizable, with the exception of costs for tenants. But but this lack of an answer almost presents an opportunity to governments and other institutions, the European Union, and this is coming from a British guy. I voted to stay in the EU, by the way. For governments and other bodies like that to come together and try and work some of this stuff out, because we're seeing such a huge growth in terms of the sustainable built environment, but we can move it further if we can find common factors that can increase the uptake, create maybe legislation that can help. So financial incentives and others need to be worked on by more than just academics like us and institutions such as BREEAM. And my final research question focused on what are the challenges and opportunities for FM in this context. So I've talked a little bit about the business stuff. So why would you, what are the barriers and drivers for building or occupying a sustainable building? But what in the world of FM can we do to move this further? Well, firstly, the existence of green leasing and the existence of green leases offer fantastic opportunities for FM service providers to create products and services that can support this. I've always said that if people just could see how much money can be made in the industry from these kind of initiatives, we could change the world, actually. And you're already seeing it. If there's a Swedish FM company called Kunstlet that has a green leasing specific FM service that it provides. So this stuff is out there, but actually the lack of answers that have occasionally appeared in my thesis are wonderful opportunities for us to be able to create new products and services. But green leasing is still under-researched. From the context of FM, I'm kind of it, really, when it comes to green leasing. I'm one of the only people doing this. So for anybody out there that wants to do a PhD and things like this, I highly recommend you go into this research area. We've answered lots of questions as a part of this PhD project, but there are so many more that need answering. There's a substantial difference, I discovered, between the awareness of green leasing and green leases and their implementation. So most people in the industry have heard of this, but the implementation is still very low. And I think a further project, again, will be to work out how to make that, how to improve that. And sustainable facilities management was definitely the thing I saw that had really exploded in the industry. That even buildings, whether they had green leases or not, tend to be employing greater forms of sustainable facilities management. And it was becoming more essential in buildings that did have formal operating procedures that were green. So once again, there are so many opportunities to create new products and services as a result of what I found out during my PhD, and I hope that will advance further. So overall, some concluding thoughts. What were the major contributions of my PhD thesis and my project? What do I want you to go away with from my presentation, ideally? Firstly, I was so proud that this was the first investigation of its kind into the term green lease. Green leases have been talked about before, but I was the one to do it with the most depth in the context of facilities management. I'm also so proud of the fact that I was the first to define green leasing as an FM term, which hopefully can be used by the industry and academia to move this topic forward, both in terms of its research and the development of new products and services. I also hope that we better understand the barriers and drivers a little bit, even though it is still a little bit confusing. And I think if there's one outcome that comes out of the barriers and drivers element, it is that we can create further research projects with bigger samples in more countries to work out how we can move forward. And also, I think we now have a greater understanding of these issues in Norway, which was the core part of my PhD. It was in Norway, and I've had lots of interest in moving this further from other companies in Norway, so I'm hoping that I hope to remain in academia for the time being, and I'm also hoping to have the chance to work with people in industry as well to keep on pushing it. So that's me done. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm only 37 seconds over, which isn't too bad. So that was the 3 hours in 15 minutes. Thank you very much.